Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Good Doctors webinar today on how historic events define generations. My voice right now is Dr. Kristen, and you'll meet Dr. Aaron in a few minutes. But before we get started, we just wanted to let you know that we actually planned this topic about a month ago, and historic events have been happening all around us ever since. And so this now kicks off a really intensive couple weeks of ways that we're going to be providing conversation starters and data and other things around how we all respond potentially to COVID-19. So today we're going to lay the groundwork about how these kind of historic events have defined generations in the past and the ones we're living in now. And then next week, please join us for our future forecasting webinar, in which we'll talk a little bit more about what we believe COVID-19 will mean for 10, 20, 30 years down the line. So today, though, where are we going? First of all, we're going to introduce ourselves. We're going to talk about what generations are actually as an entity. And then we're going to have a little bit of a history lesson, talking about, like we said in all the intro materials, we're going to focus on both Watergate and the 2008 recession, because those are watershed moments for the baby boomer generation and also the millennial generation, and what do those exactly mean. Then we'll speak directly to how having these generational cohorts impacts your particular office, give you some tips on managing multi-generational work cultures from the research that we've been doing and also with our work with clients. And then we're going to give you some ways how we can help moving forward, not only within this hyper-focused time right now as we're all adjusting and dealing with this pandemic, but in the future as the world settles again, because we know from history that it will just look very different. So who are we? Like I said, I'm Dr. Kristen. I'm in the glasses in this picture.
And I'm Dr. Aaron. I am in the curly-haired hairdo in this picture. I have the curly hair in this picture.
And it's not a wig. We promise it's real. And we have PhDs in social science. We met in 2011. We were both doing our postgraduate work in Northern Ireland. And between the two of us, we have about 30 years, actually over, of research and business experience of various businesses. I've been part of a family business that focuses on manufacturing. Dr. Aaron has been really active in management and upper level retail. And we've been working with folks for a long, long time. The mission of Abbey Research is to save the workplace one hard and healing conversation at a time, which means that we like to teach people how to ask hard questions, how to listen to hard questions, and how to answer them in productive and not punitive ways. We study people and cultures, and we turn those data, all that data and all that very well honed and trained curiosity into solutions. And that's what we're trying to do with you today. So really briefly, we structure every webinar this way. We structure every workshop, every talking point, everything this way. So we're going to start with a generic. We're going to introduce you to some broad key terms and some broad topics. Like I said, we're going to start off with what exactly is a generation. And then we're going to move to the specifics, exactly what generations are impacting your office right now. And then we're going to end with action. What can you do about it? And that's an Abbey Research guarantee that you'll get that in every training experience we offer, whether on or offline.
Okay, so again, Dr. Aaron here with you guys. Thanks for everybody for joining us. But yeah, I mean, if we're going to talk about the impact of history on generations, we need to understand what generations are. So we're going to look at a little bit of the data that we've collected. The most up-to-date data, which goes up, I should say, only to 2019 in terms of populations in the world and populations in the US workforce. So that's what we're working with here. So generations are usually a 15 to 20 year period. There is not one organization or one group that defines what a generation is. We get all of our research from the Pew Research Center, but you can find a lot of different kind of definitions for when a generation starts and when it ends, but all of ours is coming from the Pew Research Center. And groups, they're social cohorts really that are marked by their worldview. And we're going to expand on what that idea of a worldview is in this webinar. And this worldview is shaped by kind of the social, economic, political, and technological changes from that time period. So for me, that's a really great way to understand how you're looking at what impacts a generational cohort and how they see the world, right? So what kind of events do they experience? And we're going to talk about some specific historical ones. Currently, we have 4 generations in the US workplace and in the workplace generally around the world, which means that you have 4 different cohorts working in your culture at any given time with these very different worldviews, which we'll explain again how that impacts your office. Every generation represents a new culture, and even within generations, there's a lot of cultural difference depending on, 15 to 20 years is quite a big gap. So you could have a lot of things change in that perspective, that we'll talk about some of those historical events that kind of create smaller cultures as well. And all of this experience, world experience and life experience produces different expectations for your office and different work habits, which we will be talking about in this webinar and over the next coming weeks as well.
So what are we working with realistically? Let's talk numbers. The current population of each generation in millions in the United States, you can see that the 2 kind of largest groups are boomers and millennials, but Xers and Zs, like there's a lot of us out there is really what it comes down to. And this is projected for 2019. So as of 2019, baby boomers are 55 to 73 years old, whereas Generation X is 39 to 54. Then you've got millennials at 23 to 38. And Generation Z is kind of birth to 22. And I'll be really honest, Dr. Aaron and I are kind of keeping our eye on the changes and what's going to come behind Generation Z, because that already needs to be a conversation. Technology is rapidly changing so quickly that students that, folks who are in nursery school right now, to pretend that they're the same as folks that are in college right now is really naive, we feel. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that. What I'd like you to notice right now before we move on to the next slide is that millennials usually get talked about as though we are in our 20s, and we're not. We're in our early to mid 20s to our late 30s. Dr. Aaron and I are both, as we record this, 36, which puts us at the upper end of millennials, which also means that we have a lot of cultural overlap with Generation X. And many of our friends, my spouse is Generation X. And we kind of live in this weird in-between. So even as we're talking about these generations as though they are 4 blocks, please realize that the bleeding between these all is significant, and that needs to be taken into account as well. So as you remember, as we just talked about, millennials are not in college right now. This kind of language seems to be dying out in marketing materials, thank goodness. But it was getting very frustrating for a couple years for those of us who are millennials in our late 30s to go to business seminars and hear all these things about these pesky millennials when people were clearly talking about college students. And first of all, I was angry that we were, disparaging college students the way that we were, but we were also being incorrect. People in college were not necessarily millennials. And even if they were in college, they weren't necessarily the target demographic you were working with. So again, if you take a screenshot of this, these are kind of the boundary markers, the best we understand them, that are currently in the workforce. So within the workforce, here's the numbers. So about 41 million boomers are in the workforce, about 53 Gen Xers, 56 millennials, and 9 Gen Zers. So this highlights that every generation, nearly every workplace in the United States right now is cross-generational in some ways, even if your direct office potentially is maybe, uni-generational or just generational. I guarantee you that your vendors, your clients, your customers, other people, you are dealing with all 4 generations on every single day basis. and that's kind of how it works. So the point of today is to talk about how that can be challenging. And so Dr. Erin is going to highlight that for us now.
Right. So we talked a little bit about the specifics of how generations get made, right? And what shapes our worldview and our understanding of our place in the world, and therefore then our place in our job and in our work environment and how we interact with that. So it's really important to note the social changes that take place, and these are historical events and changing political atmospheres that have a huge impact on age cohorts and their worldview. So the picture here on this slide is obviously from protests around the Vietnam War, which would have significantly impacted a portion of the baby boomer generation, right? And how they felt about and how they engaged with narratives around the Vietnam War significantly impact how they think about a lot of things. And we'll break down what that looks like in your office in the next coming slides. Obviously, economic change, large and small scale, local and national. The 2008 recession is one of our focal points of this webinar, but has certainly impacted everyone who was trying to work and live and find a job at that time. But a lot of the research we have shows that it has significantly shaped how millennials engage with a lot of issues around commerce and the economy. And then this might seem rather obvious as we're doing a webinar on Zoom in 2020, but technological change obviously changes the way we communicate, spend money, get information, and do our jobs. And we're all adjusting to those technological changes very rapidly in the last 20 years, and that certainly impacts every generation. So one of the more important books that I've read recently about this generational change, if you go on our Abby Research Reads YouTube playlist, you can see my review of it, but Charlotte Alter's The Ones We've Been Waiting For breaks down a lot of this. But she talks a lot about the impact of history, which was kind of the impetus for this webinar in the first place. And so this is, a great quote that says, social scientists, we've been looking at this for a long time, right? And studying generational impact. And a lot of indicators are still very significant, like race, religion, and family. But specifically, we're finding that historical events, particularly in early adulthood, significantly shape lifelong political leanings. So we're going to break down kind of the biggest generational divide right now we're facing is between boomers and millennials. They're still two of the biggest cohorts. Millennials just recently overtook boomers in the workplace in terms of numbers. And that's where we're seeing a lot of political divide, a lot of cultural divide happening. So we're going to look at those specific historical events. So what are those historical events? Almost like I made this PowerPoint myself. The two biggest ones identified to have shaped understandings of the boomer generation are Watergate and Vietnam. And obviously there's lots of different opinions about those events and what happened, but it certainly shapes a generation's experience. Obviously, my mother, who is a baby boomer, her experience of it was very, very different. Obviously, I wasn't born, so my only experience of this is through the lens of history and through what I've been taught and told. But Watergate certainly changed views on the presidency, on the government, in people's belief in the political system. Vietnam changed a lot of people's perspectives on military, on spending, again, on the government and issues of transparency and communication, but also the economy as well. It can certainly even go so far as to look at, healthcare and social safety nets as well. Certainly for the millennial generation, the most impactful historical event for most millennials who were kind of coming of age at the change of the millennium, that's where the name comes from, was the events of September 11th and the subsequent wars that followed. The majority of millennials were between 5 and 19 when 9/11 happened, 5 and 20. And so particularly those in the older end of that spectrum, Dr. Kristen and I's end of that cohort, very, very significant life events and life-changing events our understanding of 9/11 and the wars that happened afterwards, and shaped our view on the military and politics and social cohesion, all of these really big, heavy issues. And then also the 2008 recession, which we already mentioned, it significantly impacted millennials when they were leaving school and entering the workforce. A lot of millennials graduating in 2007, 2008, and 2009 found a drastically different workforce than the one they thought they were going to be entering when they went into college, and has really, really created a huge generational divide in terms of the perception of the role of the government in the economy, and views on our economic system of capitalism have been drastically, drastically altered by how you were impacted during the 2008 recession. So what does that mean for your workforce? Those are really, really big concepts, but we're going to break down a couple of key issues in the way that that impacts directly in your office. So the first one is politics. We all say we don't bring politics to the office, but everybody does anyway. We are all political beings all the time. But your political understanding of these events can impact how people view things like gender equity, leave policies, healthcare provision in your office, perspectives of harassment and bias in the workplace. We're seeing all of this kind of break down on a generational level.
So one of the other things that we're seeing break down is kind of viewpoints around money and the economy. For instance, when I was first looking for work in 2005, like career work, I remember being told that one of the most important questions you can ask your employer is, what is their 401k plan? And I will tell you right now, if I was counseling somebody just fresh out of college about what they should ask their employers about, I wouldn't mention a 401k plan. I'd ask if they had any help with student debt relief. And that's a really, really drastic shift between having an economy, a mental economy, as well as a physical economy that can allow people to plan for retirement versus one that is focused on helping people pay off something they've already done. And that's a really, really significant shift. The future feels different for each of these cohorts, but we're using the exact same word. Money feels different, but we're using the same word. For more on this, there's a lot on our website regarding the generational money gap in particular. But this is also around, this can impact healthcare choices. This can also impact your view of the economy, can impact your views on leave policies, and potentially when you choose or don't choose to have children. The economy is a major, major difference.
Yes, and certainly what we didn't touch on specifically in this webinar, but there's a lot of information out there, is the student loan debt crisis most heavily hitting the millennial generation. And that impacts everything that millennials engage with, but certainly will impact how they view the types of events happening in your office and benefit packages and everything Dr. Kristen just mentioned. Another real big issue that is impacted by these historical events are beliefs on the climate and how your office engages in green work environment and policies, the reduction in the use of different types of technology, your recycling policies. We're seeing a generational shift in these expectations that that there's a level of social consciousness in your workplace, and an expectation that leaders and managers will be involved in this. And certainly we are seeing a level of climate crisis now, but we're also seeing a public health crisis with the coronavirus pandemic that we're currently experiencing. And, as we said, we'll talk much more about this next week, but we're already seeing immediately how workplaces have to change and adapt to deal with these very, very drastic circumstances.
And obviously one of the ways that a lot of workplaces are adapting is technology, and many workplaces have been adapting already. And the work from home conversation and the technology that supports that have been on the forefront of a lot of companies' minds for the last 5-10 years. However, the rapid expanse of that is something we'll cover next week as well, and something we want to help your organization think through if you're in that place. But in terms of technology, I think when I think of kind of the stereotypes of generations, I think this is the one that we make fun of people for the most. That, you know, and I do it, I even make fun of myself. Like, we'll say we're on every single social media thing except TikTok, because I don't really know what that is, because I'm too old to understand what TikTok is.
I still don't understand.
I think it's short videos.
But why is everybody dancing? I don't know.
The thing is, like, we could find out. We just choose not to, because it doesn't feel relevant to our lives.
Yes.
But the issue is that technology, a lot more technology, is more relevant to more people's lives than we kind of give it credit for. And one of the ways that one of the generational splits is that a lot of people, millennial and Gen Z and below, assume technology is there to work for them, whereas that is not a dominant belief of older generations. So if I have a problem to solve, my assumption is that somebody already made an app for it, and I just have to figure out a way to integrate that app into my existing systems. Whereas when I speak to people of the boomer generation and even some older Gen Xers, they'll say things like, man, I really wish there was a this. And I'm like, well, there is. It's called Trello. Okay, let me tell you what Trello is. Trello, by the way, is an online idea organization tool that we will be getting into in next week's webinar to help companies communicate when everyone's not in the same building. But when we look at all of these kind of if you look at these 4 categories in particular, so in politics, views of government are very, very different. And this has been a truism for a long time, that as you get older, your views on politics change. But one of the things we've never done before in the workplace is have so many different generations in one spot. So yes, younger people and older people have felt differently about the federal government since there was a federal government. We have lots of data that shows that. The kind of thing is, we've never had them all working in one place before, and we've never had them all trying to make the same decision. That's new. And so as you think about, how does somebody who fundamentally believes that government should be a safety net because they lived through 2008 versus somebody who fundamentally believes you cannot trust government because they lived through Watergate, how do you make those folks communicate? How do you do it? Well, aren't you so glad that we have some tips?
So, you know, obviously we're speaking in a position of management and leadership here, and how do you wrangle this, you know, very unique experience that we're having right now of having all these different cohorts in the same spaces at the same time? And they could be physical spaces or online spaces, commercial spaces, frontline, backline, you name it. We're seeing this engagement happening, and we're seeing these clashes happening. So if you're on this webinar or you're watching this webinar replay on our website or on our YouTube channel, congratulations, you're already part of step number 1, which is learning about the cohorts in your office. Obviously, we both come from an education background, and so we believe educating yourself about the cohorts in your office and different generational impacts is really important, but also remembering that humans are individual people, and they don't fit neatly into all of these categories or boxes. And so learning about generational differences is certainly very important, but also going beyond that to learn about the individuals in your office. You don't want to make assumptions on millennials when you have millennials of very different parts of that generational cohort in your office. They might have very different expectations, and certainly a lot of other social factors going on their individual person and in their individual lives that could maybe make sure that they don't fit in those boxes.
And so once we learn these things, and please know that this isn't a linear process, this is a continually evolving situation. So once you learn, figure out how to communicate together, the best way to communicate with individuals and also groups of people. Be willing to adapt to those changing expectations. This could shift, and especially in the next couple of weeks, again, we're going to be talking about this a lot. The adaptation skill is, if you haven't worked that muscle in a little while, it's going to hurt because we all need to be really, really, really adaptable as we communicate and learn from each other.
And obviously the core of this, the kind of foundation of this is learning how to provide support for your staff, whatever their concerns or issues, looking towards being as inclusive as you can with these generational cohorts and all the other social identities that you are supporting, people's gender identity, their ability, their age, their religion, their ethnicity, their sexuality. You know, there's lots of other factors that all are impacted by this kind of constant cycle, we would say, of learn, communicate, adapt, and support. And how can you build a foundational environment that is supporting yourself and everyone else you are leading and managing through this constantly changing environment?
And we want to be part of the answer to that question. So how we can help your organization is a couple key ways. So first of all, feel free to head to our website and download all of our white papers that are on various generational topics, as well as things a little bit broader like emotional intelligence and conflict management. Stay tuned for some future mini courses. We're about to release one specifically focused on gender, but we're also going to be looking at emotional intelligence, conflict management, potentially, if you have even more questions, potentially one on generations.
Yeah, and we will be processing and producing an ebook in the coming weeks as well that's going to talk about the 10 scariest questions HR managers get and how to answer them. So again, from a position of leadership, but it will be dealing with a lot of these issues. So we've got questions on gender, we've got questions on sexuality and religious representation in the office, but also generational issues and communication. Across all of those very, very complicated and difficult questions. And as Dr. Kristen said, you know, we're shifting focus here as the US workforce and as the global workforce shifts focus during this pandemic, and we'll be producing a lot of content around working from home and supporting your employees in lots of various ways as we're kind of grappling with this daily change to the way we work and the way we live.
So while you're working from home, while you are social distancing, perhaps wherever you are in the world, we are too. And we exist largely online here at Abbey Research because we believe that real life happens both on and offline. So if you're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, you can find us there. We're Abbey Research everywhere. And we would love to hear from you. Please get in touch. And on the last slide, you saw a place to sign up for our newsletter. That'll also be, if you're on our website, you can do that at the bottom. And if you joined us for the webinar, you already are on our email list. So we'll be able to get in touch with you in the future. And we want to thank you so much for joining us today. Please join us next week when we tackle the future forecasting of taking all this data and what it's taught us about what life looks like now being impacted by Watergate, Vietnam, 2008, 9/11, what we think coronavirus or COVID-19 is going to have on generations now. So join us next Monday at noon for that. Keep an eye out on your inbox and all the socials for sign-up opportunities. In the meantime, I'm Dr. Kristen.
I'm Dr. Erin.
And we've been delighted to join you for this. We hope you've learned something, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.